All right, shalom, 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 and welcome. You are live and direct with your Akazaki Yahu. I'm giving all praises, honor, and great esteem unto the Most High Power, Yahweh Bashem, Hamashiach, Wamalak, Yahweh Shai, and to the 12 tribes of Israel who are scattered to the four quarters of the earth. I say shalom, wa baruchim, that is peace and blessings. And I cannot wait till the day when the Most High brings us back together and we are once again 12 tribes, one family, one nation, under the Most High power, under one covenant, back in our own land with a heart of flesh and no more a heart of stone, with our enemies, our adversaries, and all those who hate us under our feet. Hallelujah.
So be it. Hallelujah.
Yes, indeed. I'm joined this evening by my most esteemed Akenaniah. Shalom, Aki.
Hey, Shalom Aki, Shalom Yasharal, Call Halal Yahweh, Bahashem, HaMashiach, Wa Malak Yahweh Shai, Barakatham.
Hallelujah. All praises to the mighty Yahweh, power of Israel, in the name of his beloved son, Yahweh Shai, the Messiah and King. Bless you. Hallelujah. So we are back again, AOY, with another video review. We got two very interesting videos for you this evening to enjoy. This first video comes to us, both videos actually come to us from Black Culture Unlocked. And this first video is titled, "A Town Erased from History, the Tragedy Florida Wants You to Forget." So we're going to get to it and get through it. And to the Most High be all the esteem.
Imagine a town where Black families thrived, where children played in the streets, where businesses excelled, and where people dreamed of a future free from oppression. Now, imagine that same town wiped off the face of the earth, erased with nothing left behind, as if it never existed. Not by time, not by natural disaster, but by hate. This is not a story of war. It's not a tale of conquest or foreign invasion. This is the story of Rosewood, Florida, a small, independent Black town that was destroyed in one of the most brutal racial massacres in American history. The year was 1923. Racial tensions across the United States were very extreme. The horrors of slavery had officially ended, but white supremacy was still deeply ingrained in the South. The Ku Klux Klan had resurged in power, and Jim Crow laws ensured that Black Americans remained second-class citizens. And amid the racial terror, one false accusation was all it took to seal the fate and existence of Rosewood. A white woman in the neighboring town of Sumner screamed for help, claiming she had been attacked by a Black man. Within hours, an armed mob who were thirsty for blood was formed. Their destination was Rosewood. What followed was a nightmarish rampage that lasted for days. Homes were burned to the ground, men were lynched. Women and children fled into the swamps, their cries swallowed by the dense Florida wilderness. And when the dust settled, Rosewood was gone. What makes this story even more terrifying is that it was almost completely erased from history. The media buried the truth. Survivors were too afraid to voice out, and for decades, America pretended Rosewood never existed. However, history always has a way of resurfacing. In this video, we are going to expose the truth. We will take you through the rise and fall of Rosewood, the lies that led to its destruction, the horrors its residents faced, and the battles that lasted decades to bring justice to those who lost everything. If we don't tell these stories, they will be erased again. This is the tragic story of the Rosewood Massacre and how a Florida town was erased from history, before Rosewood became a ghost town, before its streets were stained with blood and its buildings reduced to ashes. It was a thriving, independent Black community, a town where hard work translates to prosperity, where families built homes, and where Black men and women dared to dream in the face of a world that tried to keep them down. Florida, Rosewood wasn't always a Black town nestled in the heart of Levy County. In the mid-1800s, it was a mixed community, home to both Black and white families. The town was named after the rose-colored wood that came from its pine trees, a resource that made it a prime location for the timber industry. Like many southern towns, Rosewood's economy thrived on logging and the production of railroad ties. Timber mills provided steady work, and the town's location near the Gulf of Mexico allowed for easy transportation of goods. But while white families found wealth in large industries, black residents of Rosewood pursued something even more valuable: independence. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, Rosewood had transformed into a predominantly black town. Many of its black residents were formerly enslaved people or descendants of those who had escaped bondage. They built homes, businesses, and schools. They were extremely determined to carve out a future where they could control their destiny. Rosewood was a town of success, not a place of poverty and struggle. Black families owned their land. They ran their businesses. There were churches, general stores, schools, and even a Masonic lodge. The people of Rosewood were educated, skilled, and above all, self-dependent. And that self-dependence made them a target. In the Jim Crow South, a prosperous black town was seen as a threat. It defied the racist narrative that black people were inferior and that they needed white oversight to survive. And in a world where white supremacy was the law of the land, Rosewood's success seemed dangerous. In the early 20th century, the racial climate in Florida had turned volatile. The Ku Klux Klan was becoming more powerful, and racial violence was not only common, it was often encouraged. Lynchings were used to keep black communities in fear, and any sign of black advancement was met with extreme brutal retaliation. In nearby towns like Sumner, white workers resented the growing independence of black citizens. Many worked at the same sawmills and industries as Rosewood's black population, but they couldn't stand the idea that a black family could own land while they still rented. That a black businessman could be successful while they lived paycheck to paycheck. Yet despite the growing racial tensions, Rosewood's residents remained hopeful. They continued to build, to educate their children, to build their businesses. But what they didn't know was that their very existence was hanging by a thread. On January 1st, 1923, that thread snapped off. A white woman in Sumner screamed. And just like that, Rosewood's fate was sealed. January 1st, 1923, New Year's Day. For most, it was the beginning of a new chapter. But for the residents of Rosewood, it was the day their entire world began to crumble. In the early morning hours, an insane scream rang out from the home of Fannie Taylor, a young white housewife living in Sumner, a neighboring town just a few miles from Rosewood. Moments later, Fannie stumbled out of her house, her face bruised and her clothes torn. She was in distress, and she was making a grave accusation. She claimed she had been attacked by a black man. The news rapidly spread like wildfire through Sumner. Her husband, James Taylor, who was a foreman at a local mill, was quick to act. He gathered a group of white men, neighbors, co-workers, and anyone who would listen. They took up their guns, fueled by rage and the deeply ingrained belief that black men were a constant threat to white women. They were determined to hunt down the so-called criminal. But there was one problem. Fannie's story wasn't adding up. Some of the people in Sumner began to whisper doubts. There were no witnesses to the attack. No one saw a black man enter or leave the house. And the way Fannie described her injuries didn't make any slight sense. Rumors quickly surfaced that Fannie's injuries weren't the result of an assault by a black man at all. Some claimed she had been attacked by a fellow white lover, a man she wasn't supposed to be involved with, a man who had beaten her in a fit of rage before fleeing. But in the Jim Crow South, truth had little power against racial hatred, and for a white woman to admit she had been attacked by a white man would have meant scandal, shame, maybe even worse. So instead, she let the lie fester, and that lie became deadly. James Taylor wasn't looking for justice. He was looking for blood. He was convinced, or at least claimed to be, that a black man from Rosewood was responsible, and he wasn't alone. The Ku Klux Klan had been growing stronger in Florida, and racial violence was at an all-time high. Just 3 years earlier, in 1920, a massacre in Ocoee had wiped out a thriving black community over black men daring to vote. In this environment, all it took was a single false accusation to justify terror. Within hours, white men from Sumner and neighboring towns formed a mob. They rode into Rosewood, guns loaded, anger burning in their eyes. They knocked on doors and barged into homes, demanding answers. But the people of Rosewood were ignorant. They had no idea who had attacked Fannie Taylor because none of them had. But the mob wasn't interested in the truth. They were looking for a scapegoat, and they found one in Sam Carter, who was a well-respected black blacksmith. Sam Carter's fate was sealed, dragged from his home, beaten and accused without evidence. They lynched him under the cover of darkness. His body left as a warning to the rest of Rosewood. Even after Sam Carter was murdered, the mob wasn't satisfied. They needed more victims. They convinced themselves that others in Rosewood were hiding the so-called attacker. The rage wasn't about justice anymore. It was about destruction. It was about power. It was about reminding the black residents of Rosewood that no matter how successful they were, they could never be safe. Local authorities, who were supposed to protect the innocent, did nothing. They stood by, watching as Rosewood's residents became prisoners in their town. Some officers even fed into the hysteria, warning black families to stay put instead of fleeing while they had the chance. Behind closed doors, many in Sumner knew the truth. They knew Fannie Taylor had lied. They knew the real attacker had likely been a white man. But admitting that now was impossible. They had already spilled blood. They had already tasted vengeance, and they weren't willing to stop. The mob wasn't done. They had only just begun. Over the next few days, their hatred consumed everything in its way. Homes were burnt, innocent lives were lost, and an entire town was wiped off the map. And the worst part was, no one was coming to save them. The word had spread quickly. A growing mob of white men, now in the hundreds, was preparing to march toward Rosewood. Many had traveled from neighboring towns to answer the call for justice. But this wasn't justice. It was vengeance. And they were carrying guns, torches, and the full weight of generations of racial hatred. January 4th, 1923. The mob was formed. They didn't come to ask questions. They didn't come to search for the truth. They came with a demand: hand over the so-called attacker of Fannie Taylor. The people of Rosewood had no answers to give. They hadn't seen a black man fleeing Sumner. They hadn't heard of any crime. But the mob didn't care. When no one turned over a suspect, the mob made their decision. If Rosewood wouldn't give them a man, they would take everything else. First bloodshed. Unfortunately, Sam Carter was one of the first to cross paths with the mob. He had done nothing wrong. His only crime was being at the wrong place at the wrong time. They claimed he had helped a fugitive escape. There was no evidence, no trial, no chance for Carter to defend himself. Their minds were made up already. They lynched him, shot him, beat him, and left his body as a message to the rest of Rosewood. This was only the beginning. As night fell, the mob's rage became hotter. They stormed into Rosewood, setting fire to black-owned homes, stores, and churches. Flames swallowed the town, turning night into day with an eerie, hellish glow. Families ran for their lives, escaping into the thick Florida swamps. Parents carried their children, stumbling through the mud, hiding beneath the dense foliage, hoping the darkness would shield them. The angry mobs didn't just burn homes, they hunted people. Armed men searched the swamps, tracking footprints and firing their guns into the darkness at anything that moved. Black men, women, and children were not spared from their wrath. And the mob wasn't reducing, it was growing rapidly. White men from nearby counties arrived eagerly to join in the bloodshed. They weren't here for justice. They were here to kill, to destroy, to erase Rosewood from existence. With each passing hour, the violence became more brutal, and the death toll increased. A black woman, Sarah Carrier, was shot inside her home as she tried to shield her grandchildren from the gunfire. Her son, Sylvester Carrier, tried to fight back, firing a rifle at the attackers, but he was outnumbered, outgunned. They shot him dead. The mob showed no mercy. They dragged people from their hiding places, beating them, shooting them. Black bodies fell, left to rot where they lay. Even children weren't spared. Stories from survivors spoke of young boys and girls shot in cold blood. Their only crime was the color of their skin. For days, the terror continued. The people of Rosewood had nowhere to turn. Law enforcement, who were meant to uphold order, stood by and did nothing. Some even joined the fight. Help wasn't coming. The government didn't intervene. To the world outside, Rosewood didn't matter. But to the people living through this nightmare, they were experiencing their entire world being torn apart. As the massacre continued, some tried to escape. A few sympathetic white residents like John and William Bryce used their train to help black women and children flee. They risked their lives, knowing the mob wouldn't hesitate to turn on them. For those who made it onto the train, there was a chance at survival. But for those left behind, there was no salvation. By the time the fires burned out, Rosewood was unrecognizable. Homes were nothing but charred remains. Businesses were gone. Lives were lost. and an entire black town had been wiped off the map. But even as the dust settled, the horror of what happened in Rosewood was far from over. The survivors couldn't speak of it. Fear gripped them and silenced their voices for decades, and those who were responsible walked freely, unpunished. Their crimes were buried under a veil of white silence. The massacre had ended, but the cover-up was just beginning. January 6, 1923. The town of Rosewood was already drowning in terror, but what happened on this day erased it from history. By sunset, there would be no Rosewood left. The white mob, now numbering in the hundreds, was out for blood. They had murdered men in cold blood. They had terrorized families and ransacked homes. But it still wasn't enough. They wanted the destruction of the community. They began setting fire to every building that stood. The homes black families had worked so hard to build were gone in a matter of minutes. Churches that had once been filled with joyful voices were crumbled to smoldering ruins. Schools where black children had dreamed of a better future had now turned to ash. Dense smoke filled the air, making it impossible to breathe. The heat was unbearable, and for the people of Rosewood, there was nowhere left to run or hide. Women and children had no choice but to flee into the wilderness. At midnight, they stumbled through the swamps, barefoot, bleeding, with nothing but the clothes they had on. The sound of gunshots rang behind them. Every step could be their last. Mothers clutched their babies tightly, praying they wouldn't cry, praying they wouldn't be heard. But the mob was relentless. They hunted them down like animals. And those who were caught, they were shown no mercy. Survivors later told stories of unimaginable horror. Black men were dragged from their hiding places and shot on sight. Others were lynched, their bodies left hanging as warnings to anyone who dared to resist. The mob was celebrating. They posed for pictures next to the bodies of their victims. They cheered as homes collapsed into flames. This wasn't just about punishing one man. This was about erasing an entire black town from existence. For the children of Rosewood, the nightmare never ended. Many were too young to understand why they were running, why their fathers weren't coming back, and why the town they had called home no longer existed. But while all this horror went on, there was one place that had a glimpse of hope: John Richt's home. John Wright was a white store owner, one of the few in Rosewood who saw the massacre for what it was: pure evil. Unlike his neighbors, he didn't turn his back. Instead, he risked everything to save those he could. One by one, desperate families arrived at his doorstep. He let them in. He hid them. He gave them food and water. He knew that if the mob found out, they would kill him too. But still, he didn't stop. And then John Wright did something even more extreme. He helped them escape. This spread to a sympathetic train conductor in nearby Gainesville. Late at night, he slowed his train just enough for the survivors to climb aboard. Women, children, and the elderly packed together, desperate to get away. They left everything behind. But at least they had their lives. They didn't know where they were going. Some ended up in Gainesville, others in towns further away. Many never saw each other again. Rosewood had been their home. Now they were refugees in their own country. And what did the government do? Nothing. No one in power tried to stop the slaughter. No one in law enforcement arrested the killers. No one even acknowledged what had happened to even render an apology. The local sheriff knew exactly who was responsible for the murders. He knew the names of the men who had led the mob. But in Jim Crow, Florida, white men didn't get punished for killing black people. Newspapers barely wrote about the massacre. Some even justified it by calling it a race riot, as if both sides had been equally at fault. The truth was buried, just like the victims. For decades, the survivors of Rosewood lived in silence. They were too afraid to tell their stories, the fear of the same thing happening again. And for many, that fear never faded. When the fires died down, there was nothing left. The land where Rosewood once thrived was abandoned, swallowed by time. No one rebuilt. No one returned. Today, the only thing that remains of Rosewood is a small road sign, a reminder of what was lost. But the story of Rosewood isn't just history. It's a warning. Because Rosewood was not the first black town to be destroyed. And tragically, it wouldn't be the last. The town of Rosewood was gone, burned to the ground. its people scattered, many fleeing with only one cloth. Families who had once thrived were now homeless, being forced into an exile they never expected. But what followed the massacre was perhaps even more chilling: silence. In the days and weeks after the massacre, the nation should have been outraged. The state of Florida should have pursued justice. Law enforcement should have hunted down those responsible. But none of that happened. Instead, the story of Rosewood was buried, erased, as if it had never happened at all. The newspapers that did report on the events twisted the truth. Some claimed that the black residents of Rosewood had been the aggressors and that the white mob had only acted in self-defense. Others barely mentioned it at all, burying the story in small, forgettable columns as if the destruction of an entire town was nothing more than an unfortunate misunderstanding. There were a few who knew the truth: some white citizens of Sumner, some law enforcement officers, and of course, the survivors of Rosewood. But fear gripped them all. Those who had witnessed the horror firsthand understood that speaking out could mean death. The mob had been ruthless, and those who participated in the massacre were still walking freely, unpunished, unrepentant, and with no remorse. Who would dare challenge them? The survivors of Rosewood lived with that fear for decades. They never spoke of what had happened, not even to their children. They carried the trauma with them, hidden beneath layers of silence. Although some told their children the stories under strict measures, not to say it outside, but to pass it down to other generations. To say the wrong thing to the wrong person could bring back the violence. To even acknowledge Rosewood's existence was dangerous. And so, Rosewood became a whisper, a ghost town in the truest sense. A tragedy left unspoken because speaking of it could cost lives. But fear wasn't the only reason Rosewood faded from memory. There were other forces at work, forces determined to wipe its very existence from history. By the 1940s, Rosewood had disappeared from official maps. The place where the town once stood was swallowed by overgrown trees and empty land. No markers, no signs, no acknowledgement that a thriving black community had once called it home. The land that once belonged to black families was taken, absorbed into the properties of white landowners. The survivors were too afraid or too powerless to fight back. They were left with nothing: no compensation, no restitution, just the knowledge that the place they had built with their own hands had been stolen and that they would never return. However, justice never came. No law enforcement officer was ever held accountable for standing by and allowing the mob to carry out its terror. No court ever heard the voices of the survivors, the legal system. For decades, the people who had once called Rosewood home kept their pain locked away. Some never spoke of it again, others tried to forget. But history cannot be erased so easily. And though the world tried to forget Rosewood, its survivors carried the truth in their hearts. Rosewood was more than a town. It was a symbol, a dream of black prosperity that was wiped out by the forces of racism and hatred. A place where families built their futures, only to have them stolen in a matter of days. But silence can only last for so long, and as time passed, whispers of Rosewood began to resurface. The truth, buried for decades, was waiting to be told. For decades, the town of Rosewood existed only in the memories of those who had survived its destruction. The ashes had settled, the land had grown over, but the wounds remained. For those who had escaped the horrors of January 1923, survival came at a cost. They had lost their homes, their businesses, and the very community that had once protected them. But worse than that, they had lost their voices. They knew that speaking out could mean more violence and more suffering. And so they kept their pain buried deep within. Some children grew up only hearing whispers about what had happened. Some never knew at all. The survivors had been taught one painful lesson: America was not ready to hear their truth. Officially, Rosewood was erased, not just from the map, but from history itself. The newspapers of the time either distorted the truth or ignored it entirely. And with no accountability, no justice, and no records to challenge the lies, the tragedy of Rosewood was reduced to nothing more than a forgotten ghost town. Then, in 1982, the silence was broken. A journalist from St. Petersburg Times, Gary Moore, stumbled upon whispers of a massacre in rural Florida, one that had never been fully documented. He was intrigued. He began digging, searching for the truth. What he found was shocking. Survivors, now in their 70s and 80s, they reluctantly shared their stories, many for the first time. They spoke of the horrors they had witnessed, the burning homes, the lynchings, the nights spent hiding in the swamps. They named names. They described the terror of running from their countrymen, knowing they had nowhere to turn. Their voices that has long been suppressed had finally found an audience. The world was beginning to listen. As Moore's reporting gained attention, the survivors of Rosewood saw an opportunity, one they never thought possible. They would demand justice. But in a country that had ignored them for so long, but could they truly win? In the early 1990s, the remaining survivors and their descendants took their fight to the Florida legislature. They wanted acknowledgement. They wanted accountability. And most importantly, they wanted reparations. For years, they fought an uphill battle. They faced skepticism, resistance, and even threats. But they had one thing on their side: undeniable proof. The truth was out. And in 1994, after extensive hearings and emotional testimonies, Florida made history. Florida became the first U.S. state to compensate victims of racial violence. The Rosewood Compensation Bill was passed, awarding $2.1 million to the survivors and their families. For those who had lived through the horror, no amount of money could erase the pain. However, this was more than compensation. It was recognition. It was proof that the massacre had happened, that their suffering had not been in vain. For the first time in American history, a state had officially admitted its role in racial violence and taken action to make amends. This acknowledgement came with something even more powerful: awareness. The story of Rosewood that was once buried was now being told. Books were written, documentaries were produced, and in 1997, Hollywood brought the tragedy to the big screen with the film Rosewood, directed by John Singleton. For many, this was their first time hearing about Rosewood. While the film was dramatized, it reignited discussions about America's violent racial history. It forced audiences to confront the reality of what had been done to an entire community and how easily that history had been erased. More importantly, it ensured that Rosewood would never be forgotten again. The town that was once wiped off the map was now recognized as a historic site. Markers were placed, memorials were built, and the descendants of Rosewood's residents could finally walk the land and see their ancestors honored. The story of Rosewood is not just a story of loss. It is a story of survival, a story of resilience, a story of truth finally rising after decades of being buried beneath lies and silence. Though the town itself is gone, its legacy continues to live in those who refuse to let its history fade. The survivors, the journalists, the activists, the families, all of them played a role in making sure Rosewood's name was remembered. It took more than 70 years, but the truth prevailed at last. And as long as we remember Rosewood, as long as we speak its name, we ensure that history will never again be erased. When the ashes of Rosewood settled, when the smoke had cleared, what was left behind wasn't just the rubble of a town, but the deep scar of a lost history. A history that many tried to erase, but a history that refuses to be forgotten. Today, we know the story of Rosewood, but for decades, it was a story silenced by fear, shame, and the systematic erasure of Black voices. The massacre at Rosewood was part of a larger framework, one of violent racial repression that echoed throughout the South and beyond. It connects to tragedies like the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, where a thriving Black community was also destroyed by a white mob. And it links back further, even to the Colfax Massacre of 1873, where the systematic violence against Black people wasn't just about terror, it was about erasing Black power and influence. These massacres were not random acts of violence. They were deeply connected. They were fueled by a fear of Black success, a fear that Black people might be able to build lives of dignity and autonomy in a world that desperately wanted to keep them oppressed. The destruction of Black prosperity was a violent act of control, whether it was in Tulsa, in Colfax, or in Rosewood, an attempt to strip Black people of their power and their place in American society. In Rosewood, it was the prosperity of the Black community that made them a target. The same can be said for the Greenwood district in Tulsa, known as Black Wall Street, which was thriving until it was razed to the ground in just 24 hours by an enraged white mob. The people of Colfax, Louisiana, suffered a similar fate in 1873 when armed white supremacists targeted Black citizens who had gained political power and were successfully leading the town's government. But while these massacres are often linked through history, it's not just the violence that connects them, it's the erasure. For decades, the massacre wasn't taught in schools. There was no public memorial, no recognition of the lives lost. It was as if the world decided that Rosewood didn't matter. The systematic racism that allowed Rosewood to be erased is still present today in the way history is taught and also the way history is remembered. Time and again, Black experiences, especially those of suffering and resistance, are left out of the public narratives. We see it in the continued omission of Black history from textbooks. We see it in the minimization of Black accomplishments and tragedies. And we see it in the silence that surrounds acts of racial violence. The erasure of history doesn't stop at the removal of monuments or the lack of representation. It continues when stories are forgotten, when the trauma isn't acknowledged, when the survivors' voices are silenced. The massacre at Rosewood is one of many examples of a violent attempt to bury a truth too uncomfortable for those in power to face. And yet, the fight for recognition has not ended. The survivors of Rosewood and their descendants have continued to demand justice. In 1994, Florida Governor Lawton Chiles issued a formal apology for the state's role in the massacre, and in 1994, a state commission was established to investigate the massacre. While it wasn't enough to undo the damage, it was a start. More recently, the demand for reparations for the descendants of those harmed by racial violence has gained more attention. Reparations are not just about money. They are about justice. They are about acknowledging that the wealth created by Black communities like Rosewood wasn't simply stolen. It was destroyed by hatred and racial violence. Reparation is also about telling the truth of America's history, about giving voice to those who have been silenced for too long. And they are about correcting a legacy of inequity that has been perpetuated for generations. The need to reckon with the past is not just about the past. It is about the future. It's about ensuring that the wounds of Rosewood, Tulsa, Colfax, and countless other forgotten massacres are never repeated. When we fail to acknowledge this history, we perpetuate the same cycles of hatred, division, and destruction that have plagued this country for centuries. Let us remember Rosewood, not just in sorrow, but in solidarity. And let that remembrance fuel the fight for justice, for reparations, and for a future where no one ever has to experience the horror of erasure again. If you want to join the movement of unraveling the truth of the Black history that has long been hidden from us, click the notification bell and like this video.
Shalom, Aki.
My bad, I'm just talking and I didn't realize I didn't have the mute off of it. But I was saying what a horribly depressing yet powerful story that this is. And I'm sure that everyone's seen that Rosewood movie back in the day. And I need to get that for my collection. It kind of burned me a little bit when he talked about them having a Masonic lodge. I was like, oh my goodness, that's really, I hate to try to justify anything, and I'm not going to do that. But you can't mess with the Most High like that. You know what I'm saying? You got to serve the Most High in spirit and truth. You can't turn to that of your adversaries and think that the Most High gonna be pleased with that. That's just no bueno. Um, that's all I'm gonna say about that. But I tell you, I almost stopped the video, not stopped it, but I almost paused it when he said Sylvester died in the movie. Sylvester lived. He made it all the way to the end.
You know, I remember us talking about that because we had reviewed. I want to say we had not this video, but we had reviewed Rosewood before, and
Yeah.
I remember us discussing that
Yeah.
how the movie wasn't all the way accurate with his history.
Right. I'm like, man, that's crazy. I thought I did think that he lived, but apparently he did not. So yeah, because I remember Sylvester, he was the Don Cheadle played him, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, his mother got shot, and in the movie he said, well, they carried him out in his mama's coffin. The sheriff made them take the coffin outside, and that's how he was able to get out before the house burned down. So yeah, that was in the movie. I'm gonna get that movie and add it to my collection. I'm sure it's out there. But anyway, yeah, this is a horrible situation that it exists in in reality, and a lot of that information was hidden, and that was the again the reality that we dealt with is that not only did they do these things to us, but they also hid it, kept it under wraps from a lot of us. So we weren't even privy to uh, a lot of the information until,
Kind
yeah. So it's crazy. It's crazy. But, we got to learn from these things and really get, better. Uh, and yeah, we still got healing to do. This
of.
wasn't that long ago. But 1940s, that was not long ago at all. That was fairly recently. You know what I'm saying? Like it's 2025. I remember the 90s. Being around in the 90s, and we wasn't. We saw the movie, but we thought that was just the way it was, and it was sadly, but that don't make it okay. But I'm gonna rest there. Go ahead.
Like I said, we had reviewed, another separate story on Rosewood, in the years previous, might have been last year, but with all of the information that we have covered, all praises to the Most High that we've got more information this time around with some of these stories.
Yeah.
So the movie or the documentary mentioned other Negro cities that were burned to the ground by the Gentiles and them being jealous of the success. We've covered a bunch of stories, and they mentioned Greenwood in Tulsa, right?
Right.
So would you believe that there is a correlation between the people of Rosewood and the people of Tulsa and Greenwood? And I'm gonna help you draw the conclusion. Okay.
Go ahead,
So yeah, it's deep. It's deep. So this city of Rosewood, in America's early history had always been a place for that area had always been a place for our people to run for refuge.
Uh-huh.
And it's gonna make sense. So remember, hold on, let me get there. So Rosewood was in Levy County, Levy County, Florida, which is located north central Florida. The county seat is Bronson. The county name is named after Debbie Levi or Levy. It says that Levy County was created in 1845 by Florida legislature from lands formerly occupied by the Seminole Indians.
Wow.
And what do we know about the Seminole Indians?
Runaway slaves.
They were. So I want the viewers to also be aware that next week is Purim, and we've got a special video coming out detailing we're going to highlight different wars that our people fought over here in America in this captivity. And so there's a correlation between the Gullah people and the Seminole people. The Gullah people and the Seminole people, many people argue today that the Black Seminoles are actually just the Gullah people. So when the Seminoles were removed from their lands in Florida, they moved them west to a place called Indian Territory, which later became Oklahoma.
Wow.
Many of these people Negroes who were replaced or who were displaced with on this Trail of Tears began formulating cities in Oklahoma. Some of them went to defend Mexico against America, from there, America trying to take parts of Mexico, right? So there's a correlation between these people, these people from Rosewood and these people from Tulsa. Just something. I know people might not care anything about that, but I thought it was neat. I thought it was real neat.
Yeah, that is wow. I didn't realize that, Akeem. That's interesting. I'm looking forward to getting into that video and really digging deep into that, as we really just started hearing about Greenwood. Within the last 7 to 10 years. It's been that long. I don't think it's been that long. Like information.
I'm trying to think I'm trying to think of when I became aware of that situation. I know I wasn't privy to it when the Gap Band came out with the song, or even hearing it, not really understanding what they were talking about. You're right, it hadn't been that long that's been something that I've been aware of.
Yeah, this has been something that was definitely hidden and kept from us. So, but we'll get more into that. We do have a second video to jump into, and we'll wrap it up and let everybody get some shut eye tonight, so that bright eyed and bushy tail for the Sabbath tomorrow, most high willing. This video covers the 1940s. And did I say 40s for the other? I may have said that wrong. Rosewood, you got that? Where was that?
Rosewood was the 1923.
Okay, so still not long ago. I'm right at 100 years ago. So right now 100 years ago. So that's still
Malcolm X was born 2 years after.
Yeah, so that's still not that long ago, honestly and truthfully. That's recent history, very recent history. This situation we're going to find out about here. Again, this video comes to us also from Black Culture Unlocked. The 1940 brutal Los Angeles riots they try to erase. So they always try to hide this information. And that's why we bring this out. That's why we constantly talk about these things. Every week, we try to bring you something. Some of this stuff we never heard of. I mean, and we've had a lot of them that we never heard about. Some of this stuff has taught us lesson on our history because we didn't know this information. So you may be familiar with the 1940s Los Angeles riot, but let's get to it here. Here we go.
What happens when a flashy fashion statement becomes a symbol of rebellion and then an excuse for a violent crackdown? Imagine journeying back to 1940s Los Angeles, a city alive with the pulse of change, neon dreams, and underlying currents of tension. The streets of LA were filled with the energetic hum of a booming metropolis. Men and women, each with their own story, moved about a city that is both glamorous and deeply divided. Amid this backdrop, one particular style stood out: the zoot suit. The zoot suit was more than just an outfit. It was a bold and public declaration of an identity. Having an oversized jacket, wide-brimmed hats, and extravagantly baggy trousers, the zoot suit immediately caught attention. For many young Mexican Americans who wore these suits, it was an act of defiance against a society that continually sought to segregate them. In their eyes, the suit was a statement of pride, a manifestation of a vibrant cultural identity in a city that often denied their rightful place. But while the zoot suit was a source of pride and individuality, it swiftly became a lightning rod for racial prejudice. The narrative took a darker turn of dramatic police raids and scenes of unruly street riots. Racial tensions had been simmering, influenced by wartime hysteria and a media eager to inflict fear. Newspapers and radio broadcasts framed a picture of lawlessness, suggesting that the zoot suit was an emblem of unpatriotic rebellion. This dangerous stereotype linked Mexican-American youth with criminality and delinquency, setting the stage for one of the most brutal, racially charged events in the history of America, the Zoot Suit Riots. Throughout these riots, the clash between exuberant cultural expression and deep-rooted racism reached an extreme point. As white servicemen and local police entered the streets, their actions quickly escalated into violent confrontations with Mexican-American youth. The riots were not simply a spontaneous eruption of anger, but an explosive result of decades of marginalization, media bias, and an identity struggle amplified by the pressures of wartime America. In this video, we'll delve into the heart of this historic upheaval and explore not just the violence, but the complexity of fashion, racism, and a fight for identity that defined a generation. Subscribe to this channel as we uncover the layers of the Zoot Suit Riots, a story where every thread of fabric carried the weight of resistance and every act of brutality echoed the deep divisions of its time. In the summer of 1943, the streets of Los Angeles erupted into chaos. Mexican-American youth, young men known as Pachucos, became the targets of one of the most brutal and racially charged attacks in American history. Beaten in the streets, stripped of their clothes, hunted down in their neighborhoods. And the worst part? The perpetrators, their attackers, weren't criminals. They were U.S. servicemen, police officers, and even ordinary white citizens. But how did it all begin? How did a fashion statement become a fuel for racial hatred? The zoot suit wasn't just clothing. It was a statement. A way for young Mexican Americans and other marginalized communities to assert their identity in a world that wanted to erase them. A world that saw them as second-class citizens. To many white Americans, especially those in positions of power, these baggy suits, these wide-brimmed hats, and these flashy colors were a direct challenge to the hierarchy. They saw them as a threat and an act of defiance. And when fear mixes with prejudice, violence is never far away. While the tensions of World War II still raging, tensions in Los Angeles were already high. The city was a powder keg of racial hostility, economic disparity, and wartime propaganda. And then came the spark. A murder at a place called Sleepy Lagoon, a case built on lies and racial bias, the wrongful conviction of Mexican-American youth. And the media? They did what they do best. They fanned the flames, painting every young Mexican in LA as a criminal. The city turned into chaos. For nearly a week, mobs of uniformed servicemen and white civilians stormed the streets, dragging Mexican-American youth from restaurants, theaters, and even their own homes. They beat them, stripped them naked, burned their zoot suits in the streets as symbols of defiance. The police didn't even bother to stop the violence. In many cases, they joined in, and the U.S. government barely acknowledged it. Instead, officials blamed the victims, the young men who had been attacked, brutalized, and dehumanized. But history has a way of repeating itself. The Zoot Suit Riot wasn't just about clothing. It was about power, race, and who gets to belong in America. And in many ways, that fight still isn't over. Los Angeles in the 1940s was a city of contradictions. It was a land of opportunity and booming industry, yet also a place where deep racial divides influenced the daily lives of its people. It was a city that symbolized the promise of the American dream, but only for those who were perceived to be worthy of it. For many, especially Mexican Americans, Black communities, and other marginalized groups, that dream was a little more than an illusion that was constantly overshadowed by racism, segregation, and systemic oppression. The imagery of the bustling streets of 1940s LA was striking, having neon signs illuminating jazz clubs and streetcars rattling past crowded sidewalks. But beneath the surface, the city was deeply segregated. It is a reflection of the racial hierarchy that defined America at the time. At the top were the white elite, business magnates, politicians, and middle-class families who controlled the economy, the legal system, and the housing market. They lived in very conducive neighborhoods like Beverly Hills, Pasadena, and Westwood, which were far from the struggles of the working class. To the south and east, Mexican-American communities were concentrated in barrios like Boyle Heights and East LA, areas filled with vibrant culture, but also plagued by underfunded schools, poor infrastructure, and police harassment. Mexican Americans made up a growing share of LA's population. Many of them were descendants of families who had lived in the region for generations, long before California even became a state. But to white society, they were seen as perpetual foreigners, second-class citizens who did not deserve the same rights and privileges as themselves. Meanwhile, Black communities were centered in areas like Watts and South Central, where segregation kept them locked out of wealthier neighborhoods. Like Mexican Americans, Black residents experienced job discrimination and housing restrictions, but they also endured the added cruelty of legalized segregation. Jim Crow-style racism that started from the South into the so-called progressive West. Despite their differences, Mexican Americans and Black Angelenos shared a common struggle, one shaped by economic inequality, systemic racism, and the constant fear of police brutality. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 radically transformed the landscape of Los Angeles, intensifying the racial tensions that had already been simmering beneath the surface. When the U.S. entered the war in 1941, California became a major center for wartime production. LA's factories, shipyards, and military bases suddenly found themselves in desperate need of labor workers. Thousands of young white men were drafted into the military, leaving behind vacancies that needed to be filled. And who stepped in? Mexican Americans, Black workers, and immigrants, the very people who had long been denied stable, well-paying jobs. For the first time, Mexican and Black workers found themselves working in war industries, assembling aircraft, welding ships, and producing weapons for the fight against fascism abroad. But while these jobs offered economic opportunities that had once been out of reach, they also ignited a wave of resentment among white workers who felt that their dominance over the labor force was slipping away. They began to grow hostile. Many white Angelenos refused to work alongside Mexican and Black laborers, and in some cases, companies actively segregated workers to prevent racial conflicts. But tensions didn't just exist in the workplace. They were practiced in the streets, schools, and neighborhoods, creating an atmosphere of widespread hostility. For all the rhetoric about America fighting for democracy overseas, racial minorities in Los Angeles were constantly reminded that they were not included in that promise of freedom. Housing discrimination was one of the most blatant and damaging forms of segregation. In many parts of LA, restrictive housing covenants and legal agreements between property owners explicitly barred Mexican, Black, and Asian families from buying or renting homes in white neighborhoods. If a Mexican American or Black family tried to move into a white area, they were often met with violent resistance. Cross burnings, vandalism, and mobs threatening minority families became a common occurrence. The Los Angeles real estate market ensured that minorities remained confined to overcrowded, neglected neighborhoods, where landlords charged high rents but refused to maintain the properties. And then there was the Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, an institution notorious for its brutality and deep-rooted racism. Mexican and black youth were constantly harassed by police officers who saw them as troublemakers and criminals before they even committed a crime. The LAPD operated as an occupying force in minority neighborhoods, routinely conducting mass arrests and beatings under the guise of keeping the streets safe and secure. One of the most notorious figures at the time was Police Chief Clements B. Harral, who led the LAPD with an iron fist. Under his leadership, the department embraced a policy of racial profiling, using fabricated reports and exaggerated crime statistics to justify the mass arrests of Mexican-American youth. The department frequently worked hand in hand with local newspapers to paint an image of lawless Mexican gangs terrorizing the city, an image that would later justify the violence of the Zoot Suit riots. The LAPD's racism was particularly evident in the way officers policed white sailors and soldiers versus Mexican-American youth. While white servicemen were often allowed to get away with drunken, disorderly conduct, vandalism, and even outright assaults, Mexican-American teenagers were immediately labeled as threats, arrested, and thrown into overcrowded jails. The tension between these groups began to escalate, and everyone in Los Angeles could feel it. By the early 1940s, all the ingredients for disaster were in place. A divided city where minorities were treated as second-class citizens. A war economy that shifted racial dynamics, creating resentment among whites. A police force that saw Mexican-American youth as enemies rather than citizens. And a media machine that fanned the flames of racial fear and paranoia. And at the center of it all came a fashion statement that became a symbol of defiance: the Zoot Suit. For many young Mexican Americans, the Zoot Suit was more than just clothing. It was an act of rebellion, a statement of pride, a refusal to conform to a society that tried to erase them. But to the white establishment, it was a threat, a sign of a dangerous youth culture that needed to be controlled, punished, and erased. No one knew it yet, but Los Angeles was a ticking time bomb, and it didn't take much to set it off. The Zoot Suit riots were just around the corner, and the city was about to explode in one of the most brutal racial conflicts in American history. Los Angeles in the 1940s was a glamorous city, yet deeply divided, promising opportunity, yet withholding it from so many. The racial tensions, police brutality, and economic inequality had all been building for years. And soon it only took one spark to ignite an all-out war in the streets. The Zoot Suit riots weren't just a spontaneous eruption of violence. They were the result of years of discrimination, systemic oppression, and a city that refused to acknowledge the humanity of its people. And when that moment finally arrived, it revealed the ugly truth about race in America. A truth that still echoes today. In the early 1940s, a bold and defiant fashion trend flooded the streets of Los Angeles. One that turned heads, sparked controversy, and ultimately ignited violence. The Zoot Suit wasn't just clothing, it was a statement. With its oversized jacket that rolled down past the knees, high-waisted baggy trousers that narrowed at the ankles, and wide-brimmed fedora tilted just right, the Zoot Suit was impossible to ignore. It exudes confidence, swagger, rebellion. It was flashy, exaggerated, and deliberately excessive at a time when the rest of America was being told to ration, to sacrifice. But for young Mexican Americans who called themselves Pachucos, this suit was more than a fashion choice, it was an identity. To the Pachuco youth, wearing a Zoot Suit was an act of self-expression. It was a way to reclaim space in a society that tried to erase them. They lived in a world that constantly reminded them that they were outsiders, treated them as second-class citizens in a country they called home. But in the clubs, on the dance floors, and in the streets of East LA, the Zoot Suit was their badge of honor. It wasn't just about fashion, it was about power. The Zoot Suit was a way of saying, "We are here, we belong, we will not be ignored." But to mainstream white society, the message wasn't just heard, it was feared. To many white Americans, especially those in positions of power, the Zoot Suit was dangerous. It was seen as a rejection of traditional American values, a slap in the face to the wartime spirit of sacrifice and discipline. While young white men were being drafted to fight overseas, Mexican-American youth were wearing suits that defied the era's strict wartime conservatism. And the government? They took notice. During World War II, the U.S. had implemented strict rationing policies. Wool, fabric, and other materials were limited, and Americans were expected to make do with less for the war effort. The War Production Board even regulated clothing sizes, shorter jackets, narrower lapels, and less fabric. The zoot suit? It laughed in the face of these restrictions. Its long, flowing fabric wasn't just a style, it was a rebellion against wartime conformity. That was all the excuse the media and authorities needed to demonize the look. Newspapers blasted zoot suiters as unpatriotic, wasteful, and criminal. They were painted as street thugs, gangsters, and troublemakers. Stories circulated about Mexican-American youth terrorizing the city, reinforcing racial stereotypes, and fueling the public's growing fear and resentment. Soon, it wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a target. Police went down hard on zoot suiters, often arresting them for simply wearing their clothes. Mexican-American youth were accused of being delinquents, gangsters, and a threat to public safety, whether or not they had committed any crime. The LAPD made it a mission to sweep the streets of so-called hoodlums, which was an expression that just meant young men in zoot suits. Meanwhile, the media fanned the flames. Journalists described zoot suiters in terms meant to dehumanize them. Words like wolves, rats, and savages were used to describe teenage boys who were guilty of nothing more than just having a different sense of dressing. The more the media pushed the narrative, the more the public turned against them. And then came the breaking point. The city of Los Angeles was already a pressure cooker of racial tensions, but the demonization of the zoot suit turned Mexican-American youth into public enemies. All it took was a spark to set the city ablaze. The zoot suit riot was just around the corner. How did the riots start? June 3, 1943. In 1943, Los Angeles was a city at war, both abroad and at home. While the world focused on World War II, another battle was forming in the streets of LA. Tensions had been rising for years, with Mexican-American youth, especially with the Pachucos being portrayed as outsiders, troublemakers, and even internal enemies. All it took was a single spark to ignite a full-scale racial war. That spark came on the night of June 3, 1943. A group of white sailors from a nearby military base, drunk and spoiling for trouble, roamed the streets of Los Angeles. They despised the zoot suits, seeing them as flamboyant, unpatriotic, and disrespectful at a time when the country was rationing fabric for the war effort. But beyond the clothing, it was about race, power, and a city that was divided by prejudice. The sailors soon encountered a small group of young Mexican Americans in zoot suits. Quickly, an argument erupted. Although the details remain blurry, some say the sailors provoked the Pachucos, while others claim the Pachucos stood their ground. What is clear is that fists began to fly. A sailor fell to the ground, and the others saw red. Words of it began to spread quickly, and within hours, hundreds of servicemen gathered seeking revenge. Armed with clubs, belts, and even knives, they stormed into Mexican neighborhoods, looking for any zoot-suited youth they could find. As the night unfolded, the attack became more intense. The police did nothing about the situation. Some officers encouraged the violence. Instead of arresting the rampaging sailors, they arrested the victims. Mexican-American youth who were bloodily beaten on the sidewalks. The city was on the edge of chaos, and this was just the beginning. The following night, Los Angeles had become a war zone. The streets pulsed with fear and hatred as mobs of white servicemen, now over 200 in number, took the riots to another level. They didn't just target young men in zoot suits, they targeted the entire community. June 4th to 7th saw some of the most horrifying racial violence in LA's history. Sailors flooded into Mexican neighborhoods, dragging men from their homes, beating them in the streets, and tearing the zoot suits from their bodies before setting them on fire. The violence was sickeningly public. Throngs of white onlookers gathered to cheer as the assaults went on. The attacks weren't just against Mexican Americans. Black and Filipino men were also brutalized. Anyone who looked different became a target. The rage wasn't about crime or patriotism. It was about asserting dominance. Police presence should have brought order, but instead, it deepened the injustice and made matters worse. Officers watched from the sidelines, doing little to stop the mobs. When arrests were made, they were almost exclusively Mexican-American youth who had been attacked. The message was clear. The system was against them. The riots raged for days, growing increasingly brutal. By June 7th, hundreds of victims lay in hospital beds, nursing broken ribs, fractured skulls, and deep lacerations. Some had barely escaped with their lives. Yet in the newspapers, the coverage was shockingly biased. Headlines portrayed the Pachucos as gangsters and the servicemen as heroes cleaning up the city. The truth was buried beneath layers of racism and propaganda. As the riot continued, city officials and law enforcement mixed the whole story to control the narrative. Instead of acknowledging the brutal attacks on Mexican-American youth, the Los Angeles Police Department framed the victims as the real threat. LA Police Chief Clements B. Harrell doubled down on the idea that Mexican-American youth were dangerous gang members. He labeled the Pachucos as juvenile delinquents and suggested that their criminal tendencies were to blame for the violence. This wasn't just an isolated opinion, it was a coordinated effort to shift blame and justify the unchecked brutality against colored people. The police were not alone in their complicity. California Governor Earl Warren and military officials remained silent, instead of condemning the white servicemen who had instigated the riots. The government's response was chilling in its indifference. No sailor was arrested, and no military leader was punished. Instead, the city of Los Angeles chose an outrageous solution. They banned the zoot suit. A couple weeks after the riots, LA authorities made it illegal to wear the outfit in public. Tailors were warned not to sell the suits, and anyone seen wearing them was at risk of immediate arrest. The city punished the victims rather than punishing the attackers. The message was clear. Mexican-American youth had no place in Los Angeles unless they conformed, remained invisible, and abandoned their cultural identity. The horror of the Zoot Suit riots didn't stop at the borders of Los Angeles. In a matter of weeks, the racial violence had spread across the country. White servicemen, emboldened by their actions in LA, carried their hatred to other cities, turning their attacks into a nationwide movement of terror. Between June and July of 1943, similar riots broke out in Detroit, New York, and Texas. In each of these cities, Black and Latino communities found themselves under siege. The formula was the same. Mobs of white servicemen and civilians rampaged through communities of color, beating men in the streets, vandalizing homes, and terrorizing families. The targets weren't criminals or gang members. They were simply people who looked different. In Detroit, the violence reached its peak when racial tensions escalated into full-scale riots between Black residents and white mobs. Instead of the police to protect Black citizens, they remained idle or even joined in the violence. By the end of the Detroit riots, 34 people were dead, 25 of them Black. In New York, sailors attacked Puerto Rican and Black communities. In Texas, similar attacks targeted Mexican-American neighborhoods. The Zoot Suit riots had revealed an ugly truth about America. Racial violence was not just an isolated incident in Los Angeles, it was part of a larger, systemic problem that stretched across the country. As reports of these riots circulated, America was forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. The war was being fought overseas in the name of democracy and freedom, yet at home, racial oppression and white supremacy ruled the streets. The hypocrisy was impossible to ignore. The Zoot Suit riots weren't just a series of violent nights in LA. It was a warning, a glimpse into the deep racial divide that had been festering in America for generations. And though the riot eventually ended, its impact rippled through history, leaving a painful legacy that is still felt today. Conclusion: the Zoot Suit riots were more than just racial clashes. They were a direct attack on identity, culture, and the right to exist without fear. What started as a simple confrontation between a group of sailors and Mexican-American youth turned into a citywide and later nationwide wave of violence that exposed the raw, unchecked racism at the heart of the American society. Even today, echoes of the Zoot Suit riots persist. They remind us of the dangers of racial scapegoating, of media-fueled hysteria, and of a justice system that too often protects the powerful while criminalizing the oppressed. This is a story that must never be forgotten, because history has a way of repeating itself. And the only way to prevent it is to face the truth head-on. While the smoke cleared and the bruises healed, the battle over the truth had just begun. The mainstream media wasted no time in twisting the narrative, turning a brutal racial assault into a so-called patriotic stand. Newspaper headlines across the country painted the Zoot Suit riots as a necessary crackdown on lawlessness, with publications like the Los Angeles Times portraying Mexican-American youth as the real aggressors. Instead of reporting on the violent mobs of white servicemen rampaging through the streets, newspapers described them as cleaning up the city, painting their actions as a defense against un-American delinquents. The real story, the unprovoked beatings, the stripping of Pachucos in the streets, and the racial motivations behind the attacks was buried beneath a wave of propaganda. Even Hollywood played its part. Films from the 1940s and beyond continued to push a dangerous stereotype of the Pachuco, depicting young Mexican Americans as knife-wielding gangsters and troublemakers. The cultural fear of the Zoot Suit, which had been manufactured and exaggerated by the press, was now deeply embedded in American media. The riots were rewritten as a war against crime, ignoring the clear racial and classist undertones that had caused the violence. In the eyes of the mainstream, the white servicemen who attacked Mexican-American youth were simply doing their patriotic duty, while the victims of these assaults were labeled as the enemy. Despite overwhelming evidence of racial violence, law enforcement and political leaders refused to acknowledge the truth. Days after the riots, the city of Los Angeles effectively banned the wearing of Zoot Suits in public, treating the clothing as if it were the cause of the violence rather than a symbol of resistance. Instead of protecting the victims, the system chose to erase their identity, reinforcing the idea that simply existing as a proud Mexican American was somehow a criminal act. But history has a way of always resurfacing the truth. While the mainstream media attempted to erase the voices of the victims, Mexican Americans refused to be silenced. If anything, the riots ignited a new wave of activism and cultural pride, inspiring a civil rights movement that would stretch across decades. The brutality of the riots had exposed the realities of racism in America, and the Mexican American community was no longer willing to accept second-class status. Chicano activists emerged in full force, using the riots as a rallying cry for justice. Organizations like the Community Service Organization, CSO, and later the Chicano movement of the 1960s and 70s drew direct inspiration from the struggle of the Pachuco generation. They demanded equal rights, an end to police brutality, and representation in government and media. Art, literature, and music became powerful tools of resistance. Murals depicting Pachucos as heroes, not criminals, began to appear across Los Angeles, reclaiming their place in history. Writers and poets captured the defiance and pain of the Zoot Suit era, ensuring that the voices of those who had been attacked in 1943 would never be forgotten. Protesters marched through the streets carrying signs that read, "Somos Mexicanos, no criminales," meaning, "We are Mexicans, not criminals." Perhaps most importantly, the riots solidified the Chicano identity. Rather than allowing themselves to be erased or assimilated, young Mexican Americans began to embrace their heritage with renewed vigor. The Pachuco culture that was once demonized by the media became a source of pride. Their distinctive slang, their style, their music, all of it became part of a cultural movement that demanded respect and recognition. The riots may have been an attempt to strip Mexican Americans of their dignity, but instead they ignited a movement that refused to back down, one that was even stronger. Though the Zoot Suit riots took place in the 1940s, their impact has not completely faded. The Zoot Suit itself, which was once criminalized and ridiculed, evolved into a powerful symbol of resistance. Decades later, in the 1970s, the resurgence of Chicano activism brought the style back into the spotlight. It was no longer just a fashion statement, but now a reminder of a past struggle, a piece of history that is worn with pride. The riots also left a lasting imprint on pop culture. Films like Zoot Suit, 1981, based on the play by Luis Valdez, told the story from the perspective of Mexican Americans reclaiming the narrative from decades of whitewashing. The play and film highlighted the injustices of the 1940s while celebrating the resilience of the community. The music industry also paid homage to the era. Chicano rock and jazz musicians infused their work with nods to the Pachuco culture, ensuring that the sound and style of resistance lived on. Even outside of the Mexican-American community, the Zoot Suit became a universal symbol of defiance against oppression. From the swing revival movements to hip-hop fashion, the exaggerated style of the Zoot Suit has been embraced by various subcultures that see it as a representation of rebellion against an unjust system. Its presence in mainstream media, from music videos to period films, serves as a reminder that history does not simply vanish. It evolves, adapts, and continues to inspire generations to come. But beyond fashion and pop culture, the real legacy of the Zoot Suit riots is in the fight for racial justice that continues to this day. The issues that fueled the riots, racial profiling, media bias, and police brutality, are still very much alive. The struggle of the Pachuco generation paved the way for future civil rights battles.
Wow, I didn't realize that zoot suits were a Mexican thing. I had a zoot suit when I was a young man, and I thought, man, that's dope. I like that. So I had to have it. It was polyester, and it was terrible hot in the summertime. But it's crazy because this particular video really outlined to me was the oppressive hand of the so-called white man, because he would oppress anybody who came within his path. He not only had a problem with so-called black people, Negroes, and giving us, the negative business. He would oppress Hispanics. He would oppress. Uh, mentioned Filipinos. Uh, anybody who was in his realm, he would oppress. And it's ironic because all of these people, you know, uh, these people stole this land and claimed it as their own. And anybody who would come here, he would oppress them. He would give them hell. Even I think he mentioned Japanese people. You know what I'm
Hmm.
saying? Like he just didn't have a problem with having a problem with everybody. And so it, it's so ironic because that's been the historical context of what these people have done. And it's not just them. It's not just blame them, because there's been a lot of people in the earth who've done wicked and evil to our people. Uh, Sister was telling me uh, about the last video. I didn't know this one was going to highlight Hispanics so much. I mean, that's really not my focus in this in doing these reviews. But in the last video, the sister was telling me that it was the Gullah Geechee. Like that's how they dealt with it, and that was her heritage. She said her people moved from Rosewood. Well, they left Rosewood when it was destroyed, and they ended up in Oklahoma, in Greenwood, and now they're in Tulsa. Majority of them are in Tulsa, and that's where they've been for some generations. Uh, so that's been what we've been dealing with for a lot of generations. And she said she told her grandmother, asked her grandmother, did she know that we were Israelites? And her grandmother said, of course. Like, who
Wow.
doesn't know that? So the Gullah Geechee, a lot of them, they were fairly familiar with that ideal. And, you know, they were fighting the oppressor. And,
Hmm.
sometimes they had to run. But, today, in this day and time, I'm not ignorant enough to believe that we could just, fight against these people and win. I mean, we
So,
could,
so let me stop you there,
like,
because we can.
yeah,
If our power is with us,
yeah,
Yas Healer Ministry had a study last night, and Benaiah had brought out the fact. Well, he brought out the script speaking about Jehoshaphat and
right,
how the Moabites and a host of other nations were with the Moabites and had come against our people, and how not Jehoshaphat, but Jehoshaphat was he was kind of shook at first, but then he pulled it together and went to the Most High, and Most High showed up in a major way, man.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I was my apologies. I was going to get to that, and we know that we know that the promise is the restoration of our people. So we're going to fight against these people, and we're going to
Hmm.
win. So
Indeed.
that's prophesied. Uh, in this day and time, I mean, to go out tomorrow, well, not tomorrow, but to go out, next week and wage war, uh, that might not be the best operation, considering where we are behind enemy lines, dealing with
God.
you know, everything that we deal with is them, is theirs. So that would be difficult and altogether. But the Most High is able. If that's what it comes to, so be it. That'll be what it is, and we'll just have to deal with it. But so yeah, but I'm gonna rest there. That's all I got on that one. Go ahead, Aki.
Con, I don't have a lot. I honestly thought the video was going to be about something else when I saw it, and uh, I hear riot in L.A. and my mind automatically goes to our people.
Right.
But you're right. You're absolutely right. The oppressor has taken advantage of not only oppressing our people, but other people that they've come across.
Yeah.
The difference, I would say, you look at the Japanese,
Mhm.
you look at the Ashkenazis, you look at you know some some other people who have been oppressed by the Europeans, and there's been reparations given. You
Right.
know, uh, that still uh, hasn't come to fruition for our people, and uh, let's be real. Like, these people hate us. These people hate us, and
Yeah. Absolutely.
I don't think that they will do the right thing. The majority of them. I say that. I will say that majority of them are not going to do the right thing until forced to,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
yeah, and then our redemption comes with their destruction as a nation, as
Yeah.
and it's just the way it's got to be. I would much rather it be that way than our people have to go through the atrocities that we've been through.
Right.
And if I had things my way, if I could snap my finger and change things, I would have done that, a long time ago. However, it's not Kenaniah's will. It's the will of the Abba, and everything that's happening is for the saints' good. Um, we're being tried in the fire, and come through just like gold, Abba willing.
Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Kind of key, kind. Yeah, you're exactly on the money. On the money, and that's definitely, excuse me, that's definitely what we got to look forward to. And they know it. It's not a secret. They know that they only got a certain amount of time, and this thing is over because you can only do this, so much evil. And remember, the Most High, Mitch, well, his representative mentioned that the evil has come up to Shamaim. Their evil have come up to the Amorites. Their evil had come up to the Shamaim. They was doing so much wickedness that he was just so disgusted. Like, get these people. You know what I'm saying? Get these people. These people are. I'm gonna raise up a nation of people who was in slavery, and I'm gonna get them to come and smoke your behind. And that's exactly what he did, and that's our history. So, praises to the Abba. We're gonna go ahead and close this on now. It's getting later and later. Uh, I understand why we do these things that we do. Number one, Romans chapter 10 and verse 1. Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to Ha'abba for Israel is that they might be saved. We want to see our people saved. That is exactly why we do this thing. And that's why we bring these videos to you, bring this information to you, read the scriptures, and try to share some insight for brothers and sisters all around. How are they going to be saved? Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 13. First thing, they have to keep the faith, the belief in Hamashiach, the Messiah. And this verse, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear the Most High and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. It is so very important to understand that we are to fear, in the conclusion of the whole matter, we are to fear the Most High and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. At the end of the day, when it is all said and done, all the dust is settled and all the smoke is cleared, we will be judged on whether we have feared the Most High and kept his commandments, because this is the whole duty of man. I am your Akazaki Yahoo, joined by my most esteemed Kenaniah, giving all praises, honor, and great esteem unto the Most High Power, Yahweh Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Hamashiach, Wamalak, and to the 12 tribes of Israel who are scattered to the four quarters of the earth. I say Shalom wa Baruchim, that is peace and blessings. And I cannot wait to the day when the Most High brings us back together and we are once again 12 tribes, one family, one nation, under the Most High Power, under one covenant, back in our own land with a heart of flesh and no more a heart of stone, with our enemies, our adversaries, and all those who hate us under our feet. Until that day come, shalom, family.
Shalom, Mr. Pekah.
Praises to the Most High. Praise you, Abba Yah. Kwam Yasha'Allah.
Kwam Yasharallah.
Hallelujah. Barak Hashem Yahweh.